Hey, it's Richard and welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, please take a moment to cruise around and see what it's all about. But for the most part, it's the modifications on the ZR2 Bison that you see right behind me. If you've been back for some of the other content, obviously we are looking to do what I've been talking about next, which is the 35-inch tire upgrade. And in order to accommodate that, I'm going to have to do some trimming here. And today we're going to be installing the Highmark Fender Flares from AEV Conversions. Right now you can see I am running a 33, and that does in itself require its own little bit of trimming, and I am running that AEV Conversions 33-inch trim kit, but let's take a look at that first. As you can see, I am running a zero offset black rhino wheel. I am running a 285 70 17 33 1150 tire, and if you take a look at the trim kit, obviously there it is. It is still intact, still looks good. It's definitely a part that I took some time to put and do the installation for, but it's definitely paid off. There's still no damage, as you can see, a little bit of road grime and such, but for the most part, it's remained untouched, which is the whole purpose of the trim kit. Out back, if you take a look as well, you'll see the same thing. Again, a little bit of road grime. It is a wet and rainy day today, but definitely no contact. Trim edge stays nice and clean, and it's done its job as I've stuffed this tire a number of times. So today I'm going to spend some time doing an unboxing of the parts inside of the Highmark kit, and as well go through the process of doing all the cutting. So you'll see all my tools behind me, but stay tuned for a complete episode on what it takes to install the front and rear Fender Flare Highmark Flares from AEV Conversions. So here's a look at what the 35-inch Highmark Fender Flare kit looks like. You're gonna have closeouts. This is a Bison specific product. If you have the Bison front bumper, it has plastic closeouts that need to be modified, and these will go in to provide better inner fender well clearance. You'll have the rear kit, which should be the same for all of them, and of course a matching front fender flare. So we'll open these up, take a look, and show you what's inside. Opening up the closeout kit, you're gonna find your typical templates. You'll have a template for either side that's gonna be the modification of that plastic closeout. There'll be a left and a right, and of course the plastic closeouts. And the biggest thing you'll see here with these is that arc. That's going to allow that 35 to turn and not hit the inner fender well under full compression. When you go to do the front flare kit, one thing to look at is these are a component number. So when you do look at this number, it will not be the thing you see on your receipt or the website. Don't be concerned. It's part of the kit for the front because they have different components. You're going to receive two different closeouts, whether it's the Bison or the standard ZR2. But make sure that that obviously doesn't get you all turned upside down trying to compare parts before you start cutting up your vehicle. When you do look inside the box, you're going to have the Fender Flares. Here's one of them. They come nice and neatly packaged. We'll have our hardware kit. I have already opened these for the sake of double checking before I actually got to filming here, but you will see it noted as 35-inch flare kit for the hardware. And on the front, obviously, with all AEV parts, you're going to find these instructions on the website. You're going to have the material to go between the flare and the body, all the necessary OEM style hardware, and these heavy-duty brackets which hold the rear section that we're cutting the most material out of against the body work. So there you go, a couple of templates that we're going to be putting on the vehicle, the other flare, and that's what's inside the front. I forgot to show this, and this is the side marker LED lights that go into the fender, and these are also included in the packaging. And here are the rear flares, and I've again opened the box. Contents are very similar. We'll have our templates in a tube. You'll see those right there. We've got our hardware kit, and just like the front, same deal. We'll have the insulator pieces that go between the body and the flare, all the hardware, rivnut parts, and of course the instruction sheet reference at the bottom, and our two fender flares along with the LED light kit. So very similar contents as the front, just looking at a different set for the rear, and we'll be ready to put all this on here in just 1 second. Now with the box is open, we can move on to actually setting up the vehicle so that we can prepare for the installation. First thing to note is if you look at this fender flare, you will see that it has been modified. It does have the AEV 33-inch trim kit, as I am running a 285 70 17, and as you can kind of see by the radius of the tire, that rear section has been cut to accommodate for that clearance. One of the first things we've got to do is, of course, remove the wheel and tire so that we have enough room. And once we have the wheel and tire off, we're going to want to observe proper jacking techniques and locations and support the lower portion of that control arm, as well as putting a jack stand underneath the appropriate part of the frame. First step, of course, is to get the Bison fender flare off, and you'll find these T15 Torx bits all the way around the inside here. We're going to want to make sure that we get all of the bits that are around the inner fender flare and the inner fender well, and we're going to remove all of this so that we can get the parts out and all the trimming done. The 33-inch trim kit is different from factory, but that is something that I already have installed and will be removing, so that part will be slightly different for those vehicles not already equipped with that. As you might know, if you're working on the Bison yourself, this lower skid plate has to come off for just about every time you have to pull a closeout or an inner fender well, so we will start there. Basically, we have to get the middle bolts here, we have to get the outer bolts here, and in order to get the front of this plastic out, all the way up front up here, we do have to pull all of this. And if you've got the front winch, that means loosening everything up front. So there's a bit of work, but we have to get that off to get the closeouts on both sides. Now that we've got the vehicle properly supported, it's a good idea to pull up our installation guide. And of course, with all AEV products, you do have to go to the website to get the full instruction guide, but it's a good time to kind of go over the entire project and make sure you have this up for future reference while doing the installation. Now you're going to watch me do the teardown, and I am going to fast forward through some of this at 300 to 400% of normal speed, but this is just going to illustrate what needs to be done to tear down the inner fender, the fender flare, the closeouts, and getting into really the components that we need to expose to do our modifications. With the inner fender well removed, our next step is to get ready to pull the actual fender flare off. This means loosening a few bolts and then firmly pulling against the fender flare to remove it completely. What you're watching me do now is remove the actual AEV 33-inch trim kit lower mount. This will not be there on a standard ZR2 or standard ZR2 Bison. This is a unique step for the application with an AEV with the 33-inch trim kit. Now that we've got everything removed, we're going to pull the insulator out, set that aside. We are going to reinstall it, but we're ready to pull out our first template to prepare the first fender for trimming. Once everything has been removed, I'd have to clean the surface. This will also allow for easy release on the tape once I've got all my marker lines down for how I'm going to cut that fender. A lot of preparation here. We want to check and double check. We want to lay out that template in a way that's going to provide us the best transfer of that line. And you're going to see a process that I go through here on how I lay out the tape so that we can get a result that I think is desirable. Just make sure that when you lay down your line that the template is nice and flat against the body. If it has any buckles, it will adjust where your cut line is. But really, this is what it should look like once you have your template laid out. You're going to want to make sure all of your tape is just on a top edge here, because we are going to fold back each of those little tabs where the circle holes on the existing fender flare were that we used to line up. Next up, we're going to actually create the cut line area that's going to be removed. So what you're going to see me do here is place the tape underneath the cut line, and I'm going to fold up each of those tabs I talked about last and create a line of what's going to be removed. Now that I've removed the template, you get an idea of just how much material the Highmark Fender Flare is removing and from what area. This is a 2-inch wide piece of tape, so as you can see, it starts at something just under half to all the way almost double that thickness. Now I've got that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and lay down my final sort of protective coating over the part of the fender that's going to be what's preserved on the vehicle, on top of providing a more accurate cut line. This is going to be my do not cross line for when I do pull out the air saw and start to cut along the fender. Completely up to you how much time you spend. For me, I like to make sure my cuts are accurate, that I don't remove too much material, and at the same time provide some protection for the other areas. I don't want to expose or tear back any other paint in the process of cutting or sanding, so this tape acts as sort of a protective layer. If you are going to do this installation yourself, you are going to have to do some cutting, and in some of the other instances I have used a cutoff wheel. This is a long continuous line across some very thin metal, so a fine tooth, Harbor Freight, inexpensive air saw is usually more than sufficient to cut across this area. I purposely chose an inexpensive tool to show you that this is something you can do and replicate with some very inexpensive type of air saws. Just remember to pick a finer tooth for when you're doing the thinner outer portion of the fender cut. This is what our fender looks like once we've removed the outer material. We still have some more to remove from the bottom edge on the inside, as well as the seam area. But here's what our finished outside area looks like. Now we're ready to move on to the inside, but I am going to touch up a little bit of this edge with the sander so I don't catch my arm on it, making these final taping lines, which you're going to see the amount of material that's left over that we have to cut. The tape line again is our do not cross line, and we want to make sure that when we cut this area, we are not interceding into that area as we will be cutting too much material. Once we've had our initial cut made, we can kind of see where this new bracket's going to be bonded into place, and I like to do a test fit so I can see what material needs to be removed. And as you can see, one of the things we have to do is remove the factory seam sealer that's in the area so we can get a nice bond. I'm going to do some cleanup after this, but for the most part we have to get most of that material off right here. Now we have a lot more material to cut down here. We're looking at 2 or 3 layers, and as you can see, I struggle a little bit, but I am using a coarser tooth to try to get a better cut. When you get most of that heavy material out, you may have to come back with a cutoff wheel and do a little bit more of that heavy cutting with the tool that's more appropriate for that. Here's a closer shot of just how much material is removed. As you can see, the cuts are pretty rough right now. I'm going to go ahead and do some cleanup. I'm going to remove that tape, but here's what it should look like when you've taken enough material off to get the closeout plate. Again, you're going to see some holes through the body panel, which is why in the next steps you'll see we do have to use a body panel bonder, and that's going to be the final component which will help seal up those holes we've created by cutting out the seam. Now I'm just going to go ahead and use my grinder with the flapper style coarse wheel and clean up the area that I've just cut. We want this to be as flat as possible, and as well we want to get rid of any of the material, whether it's the factory seam sealer or any other paint that's in the area, off of the actual bonding edge to make sure that the panel bonder we're going to use has a very good seal. Again, just spend some time here, make sure it's nice and smooth, and you're going to have to test fit that panel a couple of times to make sure we ground it down enough to make that panel sit nice and flat. Here's a close-up detail shot of what the bottom edge of the area we've cut looks like. There has to be a little step here to make sure that that panel we're going to bond actually fits nice and tight and flat across both surfaces. In addition, we're going to want to take a look and make sure again that we removed all of the material, that is, whether it's paint, whether it's burrs, anything that's in that area that's going to impede that panel from bonding and that bonding material to take a set. Here's one of the errors I had made, and I realized it just as I placed the fender flare back on. I forgot to drill and mark the hole that's in the template for the LED. So I'm going to go ahead and reapply that. As you can see here, it doesn't take much. Line up the holes, line up your cutting edge, and drill your hole so you can push through the wires once you have the LED mounted inside the fender flare itself. Now we're ready to seal up those surfaces we've just cut. And here I'm going to basically wipe down with a degreaser type of material, something that's not going to impede the paint from bonding. I'm going to go ahead and mask off all of the areas I don't want immediate overspray, and make sure that I get that rust preventative paint on the edges that are all exposed, and a little bit up on both surfaces to help with the bonding. Basically using a Rust-Oleum style rust preventative black paint and applying that and letting it dry. All of the scrap template material actually works quite well to cover up the areas I don't want to overspray. It's always a good idea not to throw anything away until you're absolutely done with the project. Here I'm just reusing some of the scraps I had laying around to help mask off the areas I don't want to get overspray on. Paint dry, it's time to line up the fender and get the final orientation of where that new panel that's going to seal those areas we've opened up by cutting the seam in place. So here we put a couple of bolts in so the fender holds itself against the fender flare, and then we look at the bottom two holes of the fender flare to see how they line up to that panel that we're going to bond in there. With that kind of aligned, I can get my holes set up and pre-drill the rivets, so when we do put the panel bonder on, all the holes will be lined up in the correct orientation, and we know for a fact that it's not going to require any drilling or that the actual fender itself isn't properly aligned. 8116 3M panel bonder and apply it directly over some of the holes in the panel. This is just going to help seal off and push some of that material deeper into those areas that placing it on the surface won't seal up. Again, I am using a 3M product here. There is a recommended product that AEV puts into their instructions. This just happens to be one that I'm very familiar with, so I'm going ahead and using that in this particular installation. As a reminder, this is a GM approved panel bonder. Since we've opened the body panel bonder, we're going to go ahead and apply that to the back side of our closeout panel, and we're going to use the rivets that we've pre-drilled to get the orientation to the exact same place we had it before. We're going to pull those rivets tight so that the panel is pressed evenly against the actual body, and we should see an even distribution of that panel bonder seeping around the edge of our panel. Moving along, we need to get the front of the wheel well area clearance for the tire and the rotation on the new closeout. This is going to require that we mark this small area just above the low tube bumper mount. This also will require some cutting and some finishing, and once we get through all of that, we're going to apply that same rust preventative paint on top to make sure that we don't get any moisture penetrating through the material and causing some rust underneath the panel where As we're approaching the final steps of the installation, we need to prep the fender flare for its final mounting. And in doing so, they provided us a rubberized gasket that keeps the fender flare from making contact with the body panel. The first thing we're going to do is apply that around the edge of the fender flare. We want to make sure that it's nice and clean underneath, and then once we have everything placed and trimmed, we want to go ahead and pull that backing material off and firmly press with your fingers on the back side of the fender flare to make sure that you get a nice even bond. This will be our final mock-up and the last hole we have to mark before we actually place the fender flare on for its final installation. In this case, we need to get a couple of bolts in, make sure all the holes are lined up, get the orientation of the fender flare to the body and all the lines that you want to line up set, and we're going to mark that front hole, remove the fender flare, and we're going to install that rivnut. If you've not done a rivnut installation before and you don't have the tool, they do provide you with the basic tool, and that's going to require that you do some pre-drilling, get the appropriate size drill, place the rivnut into its hole, and we're going to use the installation tool here. I'm using an impact. You can do it by hand. They do recommend that you do not apply too much torque as you can pull it through the body, but if you follow the instructions, it'll give you some guidance on how much to pull, and we're going to have our last mounting hole. This will then allow us to take that fender and put it in for the final time. Don't forget, we do have to place that LED into the fender and as well run the wiring through the hole we've already created. Here's our first view of the finished fender flare mounted to the fender, and we just have a couple other steps to do to finish up the installation. But if you notice, you have everything correctly placed. You're going to have the front of the fender flare even to that front filler body panel. You're going to see that that's going to be just above the body line when you cinch everything down. Then when we look to the back side, we want to make sure the back of the fender flare follows the line of the door and doesn't intercede into that area. So if you have everything set up correctly, this is pretty much what the fender flare looks like. And of course, if you got to make some adjustments, just loosen the bolts and retighten accordingly. One of the last modifications we have to make is unique to the Bison, and that's because we have that front bumper. That bumper has a plastic closeout, and as you'll see in this cutout area, we do have to remove part of that closeout that interferes with a 35-inch tire at stock height when it rotates left and right. So we're going to remove the back portion of the closeout using the template. That'll give us some guidelines, and then we're going to replace that area that we've taken out with a new panel that's included in the kit. There's a bunch of cutting here, and of course it's plastics. We want to take our time, cut the material that we need, but also take in consideration that what we're removing is going to be hidden underneath that new closeout insert. So if you're a little jagged or rough here, the only person that's going to know is you. As you can see, I'm going to take a little extra time just to make sure that it's a nice and finished look. But again, if you do make some errors here or make some adjustments, or you have a pretty rough cut, it is something that isn't necessarily going to be seen. So spend as much time as you want. Just make sure you're happy with the work you've done. Last step that we have to do is insert the U-nut on top of the holes and through the panel so that we can mount that final closeout. And something I did notice is that the cut line, if it's followed according to the template, doesn't make provisions for the U-nut to slide all the way up. So what I did here is I just used the 1-inch grinding or sanding wheel and moved the edge of the trim line up further to allow the U-nuts to move into place. So this is a step that isn't necessarily in the instructions, but again will be somewhat necessary to make sure that you can do the proper installation. Okay, so there you have it. That's pretty much the front portion of the install for the Highmark Fender Flares, and let's take a quick review before we move on. Here is what's involved with the removal and what you're left with after you've completed the installation on both sides. And as you can see, I've only shown you one, but I've went ahead and did both sides there. And pretty much the same results. Inner fender flares, inner fender inserts are all intact. They do have to stretch so the holes don't quite line up, but they are in place and everything's very sturdy on the outside. Obviously nothing moves at all. I do like the little seal that they've put on the outside between that and the body, which the original Bison flares, which you can see in the back, don't have. It is substantially wider. That's something you will see, and I'll show you a couple comparisons of still shots before and after. Haven't put the tire on so you can take a closer look here, but you can see here what I'm talking about on the inner fenders not matching up. And then of course there's missing holes because we've removed panels on the inside and cut those areas off that had the mounting. So there you have it. Front insert for the closeout is in. You can see that radius to give it a little bit more tire clearance when we have the new Crestone wheels with the proper offsets in there. And there we go. So again, take your time, make sure you go through all the steps, and don't rush yourself. When you do it right, it definitely pays off. I will go ahead and complete the rear section as well as a part 2. I will make that a separate video because this is going to be pretty long as it is.